Hi guys, welcome back. We're starting in on chapter 4 today, where we're going to talk a little bit about activity-based costing as well as departmental costing. So in this chapter, it's a full chapter's worth of information, but for this chapter, what we're going to really be focusing on is our departmental and our activity-based costing. And as you can see from our slide here, the chapter title slide here, this is about halfway through the semester. We got this week. Next week will be spring break for you guys in the spring 2018 semester, and then we come back and we have a couple more chapters to get through before we have another exam and then a final. So we're about halfway there. So keep up the good work. For this chapter, this is an abbreviated PowerPoint presentation compared to what's on the publisher site, and I'm going to cover basically the first two learning objectives, and that's all I really want to cover for this chapter 4. So it's a little bit of an abbreviated chapter. The full PowerPoint presentation is available on my courses, as well as reading the chapter and looking through the stuff there. But we're really going to focus on what's going to be on the exam, what you're going to be quizzed on, what's going to be on your homework. Is really the first couple learning objectives, just talking about departmental and activity-based costing. So we're going to be adding another layer to our job costing, basically, before we jump into process costing after break. So we're going to get started here. And just keep in mind as you go through this is ways of breaking down those manufacturing overhead costs. We're not worried about the direct materials, the direct labor right now. We're not worried about the revenue. So when we're talking about the profitability of a particular customer or a particular job, you look at first, what's your revenue? Then you subtract out your materials, your direct labor, and your manufacturing overhead. So for this chapter, we're just trying to get a better picture of what should be in that manufacturing overhead. How should we allocate those resources? So why and how do companies refine their cost allocation systems? So the first question there, why do we refine? And that's a pretty straightforward traditional costing system. So what we covered last chapter, where we take one plant-wide overhead and just allocate it based off of one cost driver, isn't going to be the most accurate way to allocate that manufacturing overhead, especially in complicated manufacturers or service industries where not every direct labor hour requires the same amount of resource. So it's going to lead to cost distortion. Who can refine their benefits? Who can refine and benefit from refining? Manufacturing companies, service companies, as well as government agencies. Really any business that has a significant overhead where they have to allocate to their jobs or to their customers can benefit by better accurately refining and understanding their cost allocation systems. Because remember, for the most part, we base on how much are we going to charge for our product or how much are we going to charge our customers based off of how much it cost us to provide the product or the service to our customers. So the more accurately we understand, the better we can cost, the more accurately we can bill, and the more accurate our revenue will be. And as we'll see through some of the examples here, this is going to benefit us when we start talking about multiple products, potentially multiple service lines. We can really get an accurate picture of how much of our overhead resources are being used by a particular job or a particular customer. So we start back with our plant-wide overhead rate. And these are the same slides I use in my in-person classes, so that's why we have the reference to Monday. For you guys, it'll be, do you remember the reference from last chapter, last week? So for plant-wide manufacturing overhead rates, we're going to apply to every job produced in the plant. So again, or every customer we have, we're going to take one predetermined overhead rate and we're going to allocate, or we're going to apply our manufacturing overhead based off of that one rate and one cost driver. So if anyone remembers, fantastic. If you don't, our formula for predetermined overhead rate is our estimated manufacturing overhead divided by our estimated cost driver. From there, we apply it to jobs by taking our predetermined overhead rate times our actual cost driver. So just a reminder, when we're talking about these predetermined overhead rates, and what we're going to see is we use that same formula over and over and over again in this chapter. So that's why we start with just a refresher what that is. But when we come up with our overhead rate, we use our estimated numbers. After we get our overhead rate, we forget about our estimated number, so we're only going to use that predetermined overhead rate multiplied by our actual cost driver. So we're going to go through this chapter, and we really have three different types of costings. We have plant-wide, which is one overhead rate for all of our jobs, for the given year, given time period. Then we'll jump into departmental overhead rates, where we just break it down into our different departments. And then lastly, we'll get to activity-based costing. But we're going to run through our same example here, same given information. So we have one plant-wide overhead rate. So we have our estimated manufacturing overhead is about $1 million. Estimated allocation base 62,500 direct labor hours. So that's going to be our cost driver. So our predetermined manufacturing overhead rate is $16 per direct labor hour. Now for every direct labor hour we have occurred in our job, so down at the bottom we have job 101 where we're making one elliptical machine. For every direct labor hour, we're going to apply $16. Job 102, for every direct labor hour, when we make one treadmill, we're going to apply $16. And what you'll see here is that not every direct labor hour is going to be treated the same. Under plant-wide overhead, though, we will treat it the same, but we have different resources might be used for hours, for hour 1 or 2, and then different resources for 3 and 4, so on and so forth. So what we do with departmental or for activity-based costing is we try to break down our use of our manufacturing overhead to more accurately portray and more accurately calculate how much cost should be consumed by a job or by a product based off of what we're doing during that time. All right? So for here, departmental overhead rates, condition number 1, do different departments have different amounts of types of manufacturing overhead? So we have here, we're going to first break down that total plant-wide manufacturing overhead, that $1 million. We're going to allocate that amongst our two different departments. So we have here, we have a machining department and we have an assembly department. So of that total 1 million, we're going to estimate that 400,000 will be used in our machining department. 600,000 will be used in our manufacturing overhead assembly department. So we have two different departments in this company. In real life, or in examples, you could have multiple departments. But for our company, we're just going to break down into two different departmental departments, so we'll have two different rates. So condition 2 is, do different products use the departments to a different extent? And that's what's the key here. If we have a product or a service that's going to use all the departments equally, then it doesn't really matter. We don't have to break it down further. That's highly unlikely. For the most part, every single customer, single job, as we're making a product, they're going to have different requirements, different resource requirements. And so in our example here, we can see on the right-hand side, our total hours are 10 for each one of our products, but the elliptical requires 1 direct labor hour in the machining department, 9 direct labor hours in the assembly department. Whereas the treadmill job, again, still 10 direct labor hours. However, 4 are required in the machining department and 6 are required in the assembly department. So we can see there, those 10 hours that it requires to make one of these products will definitely require some different resources. So we don't go through the same steps for each one of these products and then just magically end up with an elliptical and a treadmill. We have different requirements, we have different specifications, we're going to have different parts involved. So as we're building it, yes, in total it's 10 hours, but we have different resources used. If you think about a machining department, they're going to generally have machines involved there, and a lot of equipment might be required for that department. So we're probably going to use up a lot more resources than the assembly department, where maybe we're just using some hand tools to put together the elliptical machine and the treadmill. So you can probably just, visually or thinking about it, probably the machining department costs us more money because we have to use up more resources than in the assembly department. Machining, we probably need an employee going through with the equipment, but we have to be running machines, so using electricity, using depreciation, the mortgage maybe to pay for the loan payments for those machines that we bought. Generally in manufacturing, if you're talking about using some machinery, those machines generally cost us a good amount of money, so that is going to reflect in this manufacturing overhead. Assembly department still need an employee, so that's kind of the same in both, but chances are they're not using some heavy-duty machinery. They might be putting things together. Again, if you've ever put together an elliptical or a treadmill, screws, lining up different parts, screwdriver maybe. It's probably not going to have some heavy-duty overhead required after the person putting it together. So step 3 here, once we've gone through and said, yes, we have different departments that have different requirements, and yes, our products require those departments differently, we're going to establish our our departmental overhead rates. And what we do there is basically we go through and calculate a predetermined overhead rate for each one of our departments. But because it's departmental overhead, we're going to call it, instead of predetermined overhead rate, our departmental overhead rate. But we go through the same exact formula, same exact steps. For each department now, we're going to estimate the total manufacturing overhead. For each department, we're going to select its allocation base, and then we're going to calculate our departmental overhead rate by taking the overhead allocated in step 1 divided by the allocation base in step 2. From there, we're going to apply it to our jobs based off of the hours or the cost driver used in each one of our departments times that departmental overhead rate. So with this, and when you're going through these types of problems, generally there's going to be a lot more information thrown at you. So your job is just to kind of go through and decipher what's the pertinent information, what do I actually need for this problem, what's the information that they're just throwing me off, and when I come up with my different departmental overhead rates, just keeping things straight, keeping things in order. For this department, I need direct labor hours. For this department, I need machine hours, and just making sure you understand where to use both. That's where, for departmental, but when we add more rates, and as we'll see in a second, activity-based costing, where we add more rates, it's just your jobs will be just keep things organized. Use the information that I need for each one of my departments. Don't combine them. Don't just add all of my numbers up. And just remember, not all the information given always has to be used in problems. So just know and keep things organized. So here we have step 1 we'll go through, and this is still our workout equipment company. So we have our machining department, we have our assembly department. So we have our total manufacturing overhead, $1 million. Next, we allocate our estimated cost driver. So in this one, we're both going to use direct labor hours. That doesn't always have to be the point. Sometimes for one department, it can be machine hours. One department, it can be direct labor hours. So it don't always have to have the same allocation base. But we come up, again, with what was our estimated direct labor hours for each one of these departments. So now, step 3, we calculate what is our departmental overhead rate. So again, our costs from step 1 divided by our allocation base from step 2. So we can see now, comparing our predetermined overhead rate of $16 per hour, we can look at and say, all right, now for machining, for every hour in the machining department, that's actually causing us to use about $32 of resources. So that's how much we're going to allocate. In the assembly department, only 12 hours is what it costs us to use that department for our products or for our jobs, etc. So we can see here, again, if we think about the machining department, we have a lot more resources, utilities, electricity, the cost, the depreciation for those machines that we're using in the machining department. So it costs us more money. Even though the total cost for the year is going to be less, we're using it for less estimated hours. So every hour in that department costs us more money. So if we remember back from our 2 departments, the requirement for the 10 direct labor hours, one of them, the elliptical machine, only used 1 machining hour and 9 assembly, whereas the treadmill used 4 machining hours and 6 assembly hours. So we're going to see with a plant-wide, those 10 hours aren't created any differently, but we'll see here in a second that for our elliptical, which is our top box, we only use 1 machining hour, so that's only $32. The other 9 direct labor hours are only at $12 an hour because that assembly department uses less resources. So we can see for one of the hours we're using more money versus the 16 under our predetermined overhead rate, but for the other 9 we're going to allocate less money, only $12 compared to our predetermined overhead rate. So our total manufacturing overhead applied when we use departmental manufacturing overhead allocations is only going to be $140 for our elliptical, Whereas if we go to our second box here, our total allocated for the treadmill is 200 compared to our 160. So we can see there that we're more accurately portraying where we're using our resources, and not every direct labor hour is treated the same. Each hour used in our manufacturing plant doesn't require the same amount of resources. Some is more than average, some is less than average, and we're going to get a more accurate portrayal of each one of our products, how we're using up those valuable, limited resources under our manufacturing overhead. So we're going to get a better picture when we use multiple factors. So we can see departmentally, we can see visually, we start off with our total indirect cost, that manufacturing overhead of 1 million. Then we break it down into our departments. This particular company had 2 departments, others can have more. So we come up with our own overhead rates for each one of our departments, and then we're going to allocate it based off of the actual cost driver for each one of our departments, for each one of our jobs. So again, we add an extra layer, so it's going to get more accurate. Also, though, it's going to get a little bit more complicated because we have to keep in line what's our departmental overhead rate for each one of our department, what's our cost driver for each one of our department. For this one, it's pretty straightforward. It's the same cost driver. Just be on the lookout for examples in your homework on quizzes where it's not the same cost driver. And then you just have to keep things straight on your paper, keep things organized. Yes, this goes to here, that goes to there. So we just want to make sure you're mindful of that situation. So we have here comparison under plant-wide, where we don't make a difference between an hour in the one department versus the other. Simply for every hour, $16 an hour. Departmental overhead rates, though, we're going to go through and we're going to look at the hours used and the resources used in each one of our departments and try to come up with a more accurate departmental overhead rate. So we can see here, our elliptical was overcosted because we are allocating an additional $20 of overhead, whereas our treadmill is undercosted by $40. And again, the thing to keep in mind here is that we're not using up more resources or less resources in these 2 different overhead rates. We're just allocating it differently. And this is just providing our managers and our decision makers with more information to make particular decisions. So they can better understand if something is costing us, or we think it costs us $20 more, generally when it comes to, say, setting the price for that product, we might overcost it or we might overcharge for it because we think it's costing us more than it actually does cost us. So if that's the case, we might be losing out on moving or selling the product because we are charging our customers too much. So we might be able to reduce the price by maybe not the full 20, but maybe if we reduce it by 10, we'll be able to sell more units and be more profitable. At the same time, our treadmill, we're using up a lot more of our resources, $40 more than we thought we were. So maybe we're underpricing those, or maybe we're selling those as one of our staples because we think we're making some good money off of it. Well, maybe the amount of resources required isn't going to give us that true picture. So by the more information we have, the more accurate we can allocate that manufacturing overhead, the better decisions we can make as a business, as a decision maker. So we have a quick check here, and you guys can pause the video here and try to go through this problem. But let's say assume a job with 1 stair climber requires 5 direct labor hours to produce. 3 of those are in the machining department, and 2 of those are in the assembly department. We want to use plant-wide overhead rate and departmental allocation rates to compute our answers for the following questions. Number 1, again, for you guys, just go back and either have the slides up or look back at your, go back and rewind the video. But you have to first figure out what's our overhead rates. And if you'll recall, our manufacturing overhead rate, the plant-wide, was $16 per direct labor hour. So for any hour on that job, we're going to allocate 16. All right. For our machining department, it was $32 per hour. And then for our assembly department, it was $12 per hour. So if you go through, why don't you guys pause the video here, and you guys can go ahead and try to solve for 2 how much overhead would be applied based off of just the one $16 plant-wide. And then number 3, how much manufacturing overhead would be allocated if we use departmental overhead rates. All right. And the last one is just when we compare plant-wide to departmental overhead, did we allocate more or less for those? And that's going to answer, are we over or are we under costed? So take a minute, go through, solve that one. So you can pause, give it a shot. All right, now welcome back. I assume you guys paused it and you didn't just let it play through and have an awkward pause. So we're back here. And so just as we go through, we'll talk out how to solve this problem. So for number one, how much manufacturing overhead would be allocated using our plant-wide overhead? For that one, what we want to do is we're going to take our $16 of our plant-wide overhead rate times 5. So under our plant-wide, we're going to allocate $80 of manufacturing overhead to this particular job, to our stair climber. If, however, we used our departmental overhead versus just the plant-wide, we're going to allocate $32 for every hour spent in the machining department, so that's 3 hours. And then for assembly, we're going to allocate $12 for every hour. So based off of the problem here, that is going to be 2 hours. So we'll take our $32 departmental overhead rate for machining times our 3 hours required, that's 96. And then $12 per hour for assembly times 2, that's going to give us 24. So we got 96 plus 24. So if we use departmental overhead, we would be allocating $120 to our stair climber. All right, so that's our answer for number 3. We take the 96 related to machining, 3 times 32, plus our $24 related to assembly, $12 times 2 hours. That gives us our total of 120 hours. Okay? Now from there, for question 4, under plant-wide, we are only allocating 80. If we use departmental, we'd allocate 120. So we are under allocating when we are under costing, when we use plant-wide overhead compared to departmental overhead for the stair climber. And again, we can see there because we're using more machine hours than assembly hours, and the machine hours are at a higher rate. So for question 4, we have undercosted this job by $40, 80 minus 120. All right, so next, that was our departmental. So next we're going to go into activity-based costing. So activity-based costing is basically taking the same concepts of the plant-wide overhead and of the departmental overhead rates, but we're going to make it even more precise. We're going to reduce our cost distortion as low as we possibly can. And we do this by not just focusing on the plant as a total and the total manufacturing overhead and our total cost driver, and we're not going to look at just our departments. We're actually going to go through and we're going to look at the individual activities of our business, the individual activities of our manufacturing. So we have indirect costs are allocated based off of types of activities used and the extent to which the activities are used. So what activities happen for our particular company and what extent do those activities occur. It's the same basic steps as departmental allocation, except this time instead of departments, it's going to be based on activities. So really looking at where resources are used and when they are used. So we have 2 common types of activity measures. So the number one the one on the right in the green box, duration driver, and that's what we've been using and we've been seeing with our predetermined overhead rate and our departmental overhead rate. It's just a measure of the amount of time needed for an activity. So how many direct labor hours, how many machine hours, so on and so forth. The one on the left in the gray box, transaction driver, is the simple count of the number of times an activity occurs. So it might be every time we have to go to the storeroom to pick up raw material, that's an activity. We are using up resources there. We have to have our people go get it, put it on the cart, load it on a forklift, bring it over. Every time the supervisor comes through and inspects the finished products, that's going to require resources. So it might just be a simple calculation. The other thing to keep in mind, and it's not going to happen necessarily on the homework or on the quiz from a computational standpoint. But for activity-based costing, a company doesn't only have to stick to its manufacturing overhead. They can also allocate some of its non-manufacturing costs into their activity cost pools. For instance, we can allocate selling, customer service, some of these other expenses that we can trace directly to our customers. Every time a customer calls and places an order, someone has to pick up the phone, draw up the invoice, send it down to the manufacturing plant. So all of those things can be allocated and correctly included into our manufacturing or our activity cost pools. For the way the publisher shows the problems and the answers and the questions on the homework and in the test banks, they generally don't include non-manufacturing overhead costs. However, just keep in mind that under activity-based costing, the more information we can put into these cost pools, the better we can understand how much we're allocating to our jobs. So just because it's a non-manufacturing cost of selling, administrative, distribution, doesn't mean that we can't include it and allocate it to our customers. Because again, as a business, the purpose of accounting, or one of the significant purposes of accounting, is how much does it cost us to serve our client base. So the more information we can put into these costing modules, one, the more accurate costing information we'll have. Also, we'll be able to charge more accurately our customers where the resources are being used. So in our cost hierarchy, we try to include activities that fall into these 4 categories. So number 1 is our unit level activities, and that's something that happens to every individual unit of inventory that is manufactured by us. All right, so keep in mind that is every individual piece. So if we go to the store and there are 15 of the same products on the shelf, for the manufacturer who made that product, every one of those units had this process done to it. So it could be the sanding or the painting or the assembly. Every single product had to be sanded, had to be assembled, had to be painted. So that would be a unit level activity. It happens to every individual unit. Batch level activities, that incurred for every batch. So as we go through and we're setting up our machines for this particular run of products, that's what we mean by batch level activities. So if you think about a company that makes shirts, one day they're going to set up all the equipment so that they can make blue large t-shirts. So they have the dyes, they have the fabrics, all that gets set up so that we can go through and make a batch of blue t-shirts. The next day, maybe we make green small t-shirts. So the machines, all the systems are set up to now make green small t-shirts. Every time we have to switch over the machines or set up the machines, that's going to be considered a batch. Or if we're thinking about building a house, every time we bring all the equipment out to the site, that's a batch. We bring it out once, we use it, then we take it away. So it happens once for every house that we build. Product level activities, this incurs for a particular product. So this is where a lot of students get things kind of twisted in their heads. They see product and unit level as basically the same activity. Product levels, though, that happens once in a product's life cycle, the whole kind of product class. So if we think about the Toyota dealership or the Toyota manufacturer, Toyota Inc., whatever. Product level activities is something that happens for every individual product line. So when they set up and they come up with a new car, so back in the early 2000s when they designed and developed the Prius, they designed it, they set it up, they figured out how to make it, they maybe patented some of the processes. Those are all product level activities, kind of the big picture product. Then as they go ahead and they make every individual Prius, now that's a unit level activity. So a product is at the product level, the whole product type, the product class. So all these activities occur once per product. The unit level is an activity that happens to every individual product that is made. So every individual Prius that is made. We don't redesign, we don't go do R&D for every individual Prius, but when we do a redesign or when we come up with a new product, we would do R&D, we would do the patenting, they would do the figuring out the configuring of the process. That happens once per product life cycle. Unit level activities happens for every individual unit gone through. Last one is facility level activities, and that's incurred no matter how much of a particular unit, batch, or products are produced in the plant. So think about the salary for the owner, the rent for the overhead. Those would fall into that facility level activity. So basically, if it doesn't fall into one of the three above, it falls under that facility. Think of those as a lot of your fixed costs. So we have a couple checks here. So the molding and sanding, each unit of product would most likely be classified as a, take a guess, take a second. We got Homer Simpson. He's deeply thinking about it. It's not facility level. Nope. It's not batch level. It's not product level. It's a unit level. Each unit of product receives this molding and sanding, so therefore it is a unit level activity. Next, we have R&D development, would most likely be classified as a, this is one of the traps, don't fall into it. It's not batch or facility, it's down to unit or product. Think about the Prius example. Yep, that's right, it's a product level activity. We go through, we do the research and development once in the product's life cycle, get it set up, get it straightened away, figure out how to manufacture it, get all the costs, all the parts needed, and then we go and mass produce it. So that would be a product level activity, not a unit level. Every individual Prius we don't do R&D for again. We do it once at the beginning, and then we produce them going forward. Step check 3 here. So we have machine setup would most likely be classified as a, take a minute. And just as you're thinking about this, in this class in particular, and then generally for the most part going forward, machine setup, when it's said this way, it doesn't include the words initial or reconfigure of the floor, reset up the manufacturing floor, etc. If you just see the words machine setup, that is a dead giveaway. That's a batch level activity. Again, we set up the machines so that we can do our manufacturing or we can do our job for the day. So that's a batch level activity. All right. A lot of people fall into the trap of, oh, it's the machine setup. That's facility level. Only way it would be facility if it's the initial setup of the machine, the initial setup of our manufacturing plant. But if you don't see some other context, if you just see machine setup, that should make you think right away batch level. We're setting up the machines to do work that day. All right, so now we're going to go into our example. So again, it's still our company that manufactures workout equipment. So we set up now and we go through and we try to figure out our different activities. So we have machine setup, material handling, fabricating parts, supervising, inspecting, packaging. We set up what costs will be put into that cost pool. So we got for machine setup, it's the indirect labor used to set up the machines. For the material handling, it's the forklifts, the gas, the operator's wages. Supervising, it's the production engineer's labor. So we go through and we break down all of our manufacturing overhead into one of these activities. So again, every company could have some slightly different activities depend on its process, but you basically try to set up what is your manufacturing overhead and how can we break it down into our different levels of activities. This is going to give us a lot more accurate costing of our jobs and of our products. So next we go through and we select the allocation base. So for every one of our activity, we're basically going to have its own cost driver. And we can see for our fabrication of parts and our supervising, that's going to be the exact same as the things we used for our departmental and for our predetermined overhead rates, machine hours, direct labor hours. However, if we can see for machine setup, material handling, inspecting, and packaging, we use some of these transactional drivers. So every time we set up the machines, every time for every number of parts we have in a particular job or a particular product, the number of inspections. Sometimes it's the amount of cubic feet used in the facility. So we can have a bunch of different cost drivers, and that really gives us a more accurate representation of where our costs are being used in our manufacturing process. Again, the whole concept behind getting a more accurate costing really starts with not every direct labor hour or machine hour is treated the same way in a manufacturing company. Sometimes we're just using ourselves, sometimes we're using other machines, sometimes other people are involved. So we try to get a more accurate representation of how much something is costing us. So now we go through and we basically come up with our overhead rates for each one of these activities. So we have our activity cost allocation rate, but it's simply taking our estimated cost for our pools divided by our estimated cost driver for those individual pools. All right, so it's not doing anything significantly different. It's really just a breakdown of, rather than taking all of our costs divided by one cost driver, we're going to break down our costs into different activities, have different cost drivers for each one of the activities, and now we're going to have a different allocation rate for each one of those activities. And again, this is where things can get a little hairy. The math isn't that complicated. It's the same formula, but now we have a multitude of cost activities, a multitude of drivers, and of activity rates. So just making sure we use the right activities, the right activity rates for the right activity. So from here, we're going to allocate our manufacturing overhead equals activity cost allocation rate times the actual amount of activity, the actual cost driver. All right, so same exact setup, we're just getting it more detailed, breaking it down further. So predetermined overhead rate, total manufacturing divided by one cost driver, then we're going to multiply by that actual cost driver. Here we have our activity cost pool divided by our activity cost pool cost driver. Now we're going to multiply it for each one of our activities by the actual cost driver. So here we have our example of our two different machines, job 101, job 102. 101 is our elliptical machine. So we can see here it requires 2 setups, 20 parts, 1 machine hour, 9 direct labor hours, 3 inspections, 52 cubic feet. So now based off of this, our activity-based costing, we're only going to allocate $109 under manufacturing overhead. For departmental, we allocated $140. For predetermined overhead rate plant-wide, we allocated $160. So we can see as we're getting more accurate, the elliptical is actually using up more resources than just using that one plant-wide overhead rate. For our treadmill, again, it requires 4 setups, 26 parts, 4 machine hours, 6 direct labor hours, 6 inspections, 60 cubic feet. So altogether, we're going to allocate $212. So we can see here again, started at 160, and then it jumped up, and now it's jumping up again. So it's actually using up more of our resources than we initially thought. We're getting a more accurate picture. And just keep in mind, in the problems, this might just be a piece. A lot of the times the question asks you, what's the cost of this job? What's the cost of that job? What's the profit on this job or on that job? And what we do in that case is take our revenue, minus our direct material, minus our direct labor, and then minus our manufacturing overhead. And then, that'll be depending on which type we're using. Predetermined overhead rate, which is the plant-wide, departmental, or activity-based costing. It's just one piece. This isn't the total cost. This isn't the total profit. It's just a piece how much we're allocating. So again, illustrated visually, we can see we start off with that same $1 million plant-wide overhead rate, and then just keep in the back of your mind that we can, in real life, and in some of the examples, potentially use other manufacturing overhead, include the non-manufacturing costs if we can allocate it to a particular job or a particular customer. So just keep that in mind. For this, the computational stuff, it's always going to just be manufacturing overhead. However, just keep in mind on the exam, there might be a question, can I include non-manufacturing costs in my cost pools for activity-based costing? And your answer will be yes. So we have different activity pools now, and this time we have 6. So we started with 1, then we added a second one for departmental. Now we have 6. And again, there's no golden rule. There could be 6, there could be 3, there could be 5, there could be 10. Every company is going to have a different number of activities. Each activity cost pool has a different rate. And now we're going to allocate based off of the actual cost drivers for each one of these activities. All right, so we can see our cost distortion. So we started with 160 for plant-wide for both. When we just broke it down simply into 2 departments, we already have a disparity there. And then when we have our activity-based costing, that's just growing as we get a more accurate representation of where we are using the resources. All right. So we have a check here. So we have for Beaver Company, it manufactures coffee tables using activity-based costing. All manufacturing conversion costs are allocated based off of activity-based costing. So each coffee table consists of 20 separate parts, totaling $190 of direct materials. So again, if we look down at the bottom, it's asking us what's our total manufacturing cost for the coffee table. So that's, again, as our direct labor plus our direct material plus our manufacturing overhead. However, just for this caveat for this problem, it says it uses activity-based costing system to allocate all manufacturing conversion costs. So this is building upon that information. The conversion cost is our direct labor plus our manufacturing overhead. So our activity-based costing is going to allocate all of our material or all of our manufacturing overhead and all of our direct labor. So when we talk about our total manufacturing costs, all we're going to be adding is our direct material plus conversion, which is going to be based off of the table below. But we know our direct materials for this problem is 190. So it says it requires 3 hours of machine time to produce. So we have 3 hours of machine, 20 separate parts, and the additional information here. So we're going to go through, and basically we're going to come up with how much is, for each one of these activities, how much cost should be allocated for conversion. Then we'll add it for direct materials. So this is a very good example of the type of information that might be asked on a quiz or on your homework or on your exam. So just keep that in mind. So we're going to take, number one is our materials handling activity. Our allocation base is the number of parts, and we're going to allocate $1 per part. So it tells us that we have 20 parts, so we're going to allocate $20. Next we go through. We have machining. It's based off of machine hours, and it's $3.60 per machine hour. So it tells us in the problem that it was 3 machine hours times 3.6 dollars per hour. That gives us a total of 10.8. Next we go to assembly, and again it's $2 per part, and as we already found out, it was 20 parts, so 20 times 2 is 40. Lastly, we have packaging, and it's based off of the number of finished units. So again, this is where it might get a little confusing for you, but the question is asking us what is the total manufacturing cost per coffee table. So for one, so for this case, it's going to be 1 times 3, so that'll be 3. So for our conversion costs, which is what we have on this table for activity-based costing, it's going to be 20 plus 10.8 plus 40 plus 3. So our total conversion cost is 73.8. We add that to our direct materials. So the cost per coffee table, 263.8. So that's how much that's how much our total manufacturing cost per coffee table would be based off of activity-based costing. So again, where you can get confusing on these problems is just not knowing what numbers to use, what activity rates. But the simple thing is, go through each one of your activities and just multiply your activity base rate, your cost allocation rate, the far right corner here, or far right column, excuse me, multiply that by the actual activity in the problem. All right, and it's okay, some activity rates are going to be based off of the same cost driver, but we just want to use the right activities. And then from there, just make sure you read the question. If it's asking for total manufacturing cost per coffee table like it is here, just make sure you read and add in your direct material, your direct labor, and your manufacturing overhead. Those are our manufacturing costs. This particular question had the caveat of, rather than having to add up direct labor and manufacturing overhead, it said that activity-based costing was used for conversion costs. If it says conversion, that means you know it's your direct labor and your manufacturing overhead. So we just add our conversion to our direct material to get our total manufacturing costs. All right, that's the end of the chapter. So that's it. That's really the first 2 learning objectives, talking about our how we allocate costs using activity-based costing and departmental overhead rates. That's it. So the rest of the chapter you can go through and review it, but that won't be included on homework, on quizzes, or on the exam. So that's just kind of food for thought for you. So we'll stop there. You guys have a little bit of work to do this week. So let me know if you have questions as you go through that. You can check my courses for the postings there. But I hope you guys have a great week, and we'll see you next week for Chapter 5. All right, thanks. Bye. Hey guys, welcome back. Counting 212 online. Today, this is the end of this semester, and end of the chapter, so